Yeah, the show is, I used the title Baubo because I love the pre-Roman goddess of chaos and flashing people, which is what she was. Her biggest story is that Demeter, goddess of the harvest, was a bit sad, and so she found her in a field and flashed her, and it made her laugh. And end of the canon for Baubo. And I was always really amused by that. So I'm interested primarily in talking about the relationship between like awkwardness and lust, intimacy as specificity and lust, and also just talking about like unruly desire. I use a lot of different, very classic, neoclassical, Renaissance era and or mythological art historical references and tried to update them and remix them a little bit. I recently went on vacation to Berlin with my sister, and we went to the Sanssouci Palace there. And it's like the ugliest Rococo palace you've ever seen in your life. And the Friedrich I, who insisted upon this palace, was so pushy about making it so opulently ugly that it actually had to be like rebuilt 700 times because it didn't make any architectural sense and tried to cave in on itself. Um, I was also really interested in the idea of like opulence as accrual, opulence as almost like a disease. And that's why you see these kind of pin motifs. These are industrial pond and stone sealant, which is what you use to make an outdoor koi pond. It's very bad for you. Do not work with that stuff. I should be using a mask. I'm not. And then sewing pins that I then push into the foam. So each of these have anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 individually placed sewing pins in them. And I like the way it looks because it almost looks like jewelry, it almost looks like luxury, but then if you spend too much time with it, sometimes you get caviar, sometimes you get skin disease. Caviar and skin disease do sort of live together visually. Um, and I'm interested in obviously that motif of lust being too much, lust being hubris, lust being greed. Um, I think I read about art for a job, and so I am also like used to the idea of creating an elevator pitch and like a really coherent and cohesive way of projecting your artwork into the world. But because I write about art as a job, I also tend to make work that I try to emphasize that it's like visual art should be doing something that a 5 paragraph essay can't. And so I definitely use these references as jumping off points, but in terms of making the pieces, they're existing kind of in the back of my mind a little bit as an afterthought. So it's not necessarily a super tight tether to the references. Um, the newest piece is this guy. He has an excellent tassel that I found at Materials for the Arts, which is a big old warehouse in New York that if you work for a nonprofit, you can have access to all the interesting things in there. And they have many, many thousands of feet of bolts of donated fabric. And I found a whole box of tassels, which I almost took home with me and then thought better of it. And so it's a tassel, a little bit of real velvet, which was lucky to find, a sort of not enough dog hair. There's a little bit of dog hair in there. That was not on purpose. And it's acrylic, oil, and watercolor on wood. And it's actually an excerpted moment from Bernini's statue of the uh, uh, they no longer call it the actual name, but it's the abduction of Persephone. And it's Bernini was obviously the like godfather of Baroque sculpture and kind of the jewel of that articulation of humanity and sensuality in a very like Catholic surveillance state under which he was operating. And I wanted to use that reference because it is very lustful, but also inherently with the story of Persephone, it is about a man seeing a good-looking young person and then literally abducting them underground forever, non-consensually. It and I was interested in bringing that element of lust in as well, not necessarily as straightforward allegory or condemnation, but adding a level of I guess troubling the narrative of the of lust as being not necessarily always a two person force. But yeah, so I think that is about it. I don't necessarily think of my work as existing in like separate suites or anything like that, but there are clearly drawings and more built out paintings. Um, the drawings I think are a little more personal. They're either nudes I've taken or nudes that my friends have just sent to me of themselves, that which is always really fun to get in your Instagram DMs, that I then try to create into something that has a little bit more air and more psychic space. So I think of them as more like intimate moments. Um, and I would say that being said, like a lot of my work has a relationship to time that I'm thinking about, specifically with the pins and also just with the high detail that I use. All of these are pen with no pencil. So it takes a really, 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 really long time. If you're wondering if I have carpal tunnel, you would be correct. And I think that there is something really devotional about staying with an image or staying with an idea or staying with piece for a really long time. I know you guys have come over to my house and like helped me work on these pin pieces. I sometimes do pin parties because I need more people to come to my house to meet deadlines. And yeah, so I do think a lot about living in really digital, post-digital. I don't know if I agree with post-digital, but we live in a digitized, sort of cyborgized world. The rise of AI, people wanting to take shortcuts, late capitalism, meaning that none of us have time to do anything. Um, and so I like the idea of a devotional, almost like prayerful experience where I can take back my time and push it into creating a moment for the viewer. Um, and I think that also extends to the way that I hope the viewer, and obviously you all are free people, but I hope the viewers interact with my work, which is that you can spend a long time or you can spend not very much time. And I think both ways have a kind of impactful relationship with each other. That's a really good question. And it's I think like the arc of me using pins, they looked way more like jewelry for a really long time. Like I would buy like vintage hat pins on the internet that had like pearls this long on them and just like stuff the paintings filled with this stuff. So they looked a lot more ornamental. And then I just got really interested in paring it back and creating either this is just like I think there are 4 different kinds of pins, but only 2 different colors. That one has, I think, 3 different kinds of pins, and they're only clear and black. That one's just black. Um, so, and yeah, this one has, I think, tricolor, and then a glass eyeball that I found that I also shoved in there. But I liked the idea of there being a relationship between luxury and violence, and especially because like the history of the gilded ornamental flex of wealth by landed gentry, by the rising mercantile class in the mid-Renaissance, it was necessarily uh, an extraction of colonialist labor. Like someone has to be oppressed in order for you to have a palace. That's just kind of the rules. Um, so I was interested in creating something that talked a little bit about labor. Also talked, I think, in a sort of like feminist sense, talked about a specifically kind of feminine labor. I like the idea of reclaiming a domestic endeavor as something that's, again, looks a little gross, is inherently stabby. I stab myself all the time when I'm doing this work. I have just a hole in my hand permanently from this. That one also, I just lit it on fire at the end in my sink for fun to see what it would look like. And so, like, I like the idea that there's an assumption or a kind of soupçon of risk that is associated. I have a very specific one actually, which was that I was setting up a show in like 2017. I was in a two-person show in a little. Well, it was like, yeah, it was a little painting, and it was of a statue that had always been in my mother's yard. She had a little plaster relief sculpture of Pandora opening a box, like a very sort of neoclassical garden moment. And I was like, let me glue a box to it. And then I hung it on the wall, and I was like, it needs something. Like, it needs something in the box, because it was just a little glass box affixed to a painting, and it looked so lame. And so I went to Home Depot, and I was like, what can I put in the box? And I went to like a suburban Detroit Home Depot and Michael's and just got a bunch of pins and a bunch of sealant. And in the gallery, like after they'd given me the keys, just they're like, figure it out, girl. I just it accidentally adhered it to the wall. I did get a little bit of trouble from the gallerist. But yeah, that was the first time I had ever tried it. And it didn't look that great, but I was like, there's something here. Why would? Why would is because I went to a bar and then I walked past an art store and they had like a big wood plank and I was like, cool. Yeah. So I and then as I was painting it, I was originally gonna obscure it. And just kind of have it be like panel, so maybe I could like fake that I had used masonite like an adult, and then I just kind of liked the wood grain because it felt like a little vulnerable and creepy. So it's not. I wouldn't. It's like it's definitely not like a historical situation. It's definitely just like Torey found this in a store. I've done another piece that's on wood. Oh, that piece is you're smarter than me. That piece is on wood. And that yes, that I spent like a little more time. Like that has like a matte coat on it that has like several coats of different stuff. But yeah, I think I've done one more piece on wood, but an ex-boyfriend has it. I definitely like my growing up when I was drawing, I would always get in trouble because I never like wanted to do a background or anything. Like I just liked kind of filling out a single moment. And so as an adult, I was like, you can't make me do a background. So I think my stuff is really about like what interests me about an image. Let me just hone in. So the exceptions and are really about like where do I feel like the heat is and where do I feel like the interest is and the the moment is happening or the touch is happening. And then basically looking at it and being like, how do I make this even mildly compositionally interesting? I think like what I probably what I haven't underscored enough is that like these are deeply indulgent to me. I'm having a lot of fun while I'm making these because it's, you know, I get to do the tiny little marks and I'm like watching a like an Adam Curtis documentary and having a cocktail in my house. You know, like it's my sort of like turn off my brain time. And so I think the result of them being dreamlike is me then trying to figure out how to make them for someone else. It's sort of like if these were just for me, there wouldn't be any kind of contextualization with the edge. I wouldn't be trying at all. But like for instance, the sort of droopy titty soup one is like I just seen Dune. Um, so I was like, we're going in the black soup. And I was like, oh, that looks kind of interesting. And then had to figure out the paper I use is hard pressed watercolor paper, which is hyper absorbent and really smooth. And so when it stains really easily, so to get like that level of black took like 2 days of just like layering black ink over it. um I appreciate that. Yeah, because it was definitely a pain in the ass. But yeah, so I think I think the dreamlike quality comes from trying to create um, just like a dynamic composition on the page and actually use the page because instinctually I do not want to. I try to make cocktails and like entice people. I think like the probably the funniest answer is that especially on this one, you can see like the section, the silver section on the top is like really uniform. Is like that's my boyfriend who's an attorney, who I was just like, hey, like we did not get to go out to dinner. He came over and I was like, I have some work for you to do. After he's, would like just change the legislation in Maryland or whatever he does. He tells me about his job. I don't listen. So there are, I think the most interesting part is that if I get people over to Pim, then it all kind of looks a bit different. The one right next to you also has like the middle portion tracks are all my boyfriend, and then you can like tell the different hands that go into it. They're the parts that look like hairier are me, and the parts that are kind of like a little that look more uniform or almost scaly are my boyfriend. But yeah, I have a bigger piece that now lives with a friend that was in a show in August that had like it looked really really, I think, gorgeously strange because I think ultimately like 7 people worked on it because it was so big. So nothing matched it's all like a little bit subtle. Oh man, my work coming out of Cranbrook was mostly drawing. I had sort of completely abandoned painting at that point. And I would take pictures on of like how do I explain it? I would take images of just like stuff I saw in the world around me that I didn't immediately understand what it was. Like a strange piece of cement that like fell from a building or something that I couldn't identify where it came from. And then I would do hyper real, like photorealistic drawings of that on clayboard. Clayboard acts very similarly to the way this kind of hard press watercolor paper acts. Hyper absorbent. You can get an incredible accrual of detail. And they were quite big. I think my largest one was like this big. Um, and yeah, and so I did that for a while, and then I moved into I moved into more like almost cartoons, which when I tell you everybody hated that, no one liked that. Galleries didn't like that. My friends didn't like that. Our other artists didn't like that. No one liked it. And I just moved to New York, and I was in like a critique group, and I showed up with this just like horrible drawing of a really sad dick that was singing "I Want to Dance with Somebody," and it was yeah, and that was the response. Just and all these like very cool girls from very good MFA programs that I didn't know were just like, this sucks. They just like laid into me. And I went home and I was like, I'm gonna make something so gorgeous that they can't tell me what to do. And that's what I did. I went home and like made my first one of these. That was very like, fuck you. So I think what lives inside me is the sad penis singing Whitney Houston. But I try for some of these. I do try to get a little bit of that penis. I think still comes through.